Picking up where we left off, episode 6 marks the beginning of the Kurogasa plotline. This is the first episode where the entirety of the main cast has been assembled, and based on the trend of these videos, you can probably guess what I think about both versions of this scene already. In the original, the scene is fun, inventive, and playful with how it sets up its punchline, cutting back and forth between Kaoru happily asking the others about her cooking, / misinterpreting how the others feel about her food, and the pained faces of all the people eating it. This is in stark contrast to its almost cynically bare-bones counterpart in the new version. This scene is the very definition of just going through the motions, doing the bare minimum to establish a setup to a joke, and then following through on that joke in just as lazy of a way. They don't even show Sanosuke trying out Kaoru's food or his initial reaction to how bad it tastes. He just starts the episode off having already tried it off screen, because I guess this more mature version of the show is just so above having to properly engage in visual comedy, even though that's definitely what it's trying to do still. Now, unlike my other videos on Rurouni Kenshin, I'm not just bringing up the comedy as an isolated element of the show that the original anime does better, but rather as something vital to the heart of the Kurogasa plotline specifically, which makes the original a significantly more impactful experience. See, in this arc, the comedy does a lot more than just be funny. It effectively establishes a strong correlation between the characters' mental states and the goofy antics that they often engage in. In terms of tone, episodes 1 through 6 are wildly different from episode 7, whereas the rest of the show is very fun and lighthearted, inspirational and full of warmth. Just take a look at this episode. The atmosphere is moody and dark. There's absolutely zero comedy until the very end, and all in all, it's almost the complete opposite of the show we've been watching up until now. And that's because this episode is reflective of Kenshin's state of mind. A lot of the tension from the Kurogasa plotline comes from Kenshin's fear of losing the humanity he's gained over the course of his time spent as a wanderer, and by meeting and forging meaningful connections with Kaoru, Yahiko, and Sanosuke. And all of that tension spikes and culminates into an episode where the difference in tone is felt in every single frame. But in the new version, that difference isn't felt as strongly, if at all, and that's because the comedy matters. How you handle the comedy in this story matters. This tonal shift doesn't feel as potent or meaningful because the thing you're contrasting it with is almost non-existent. It feels like the new anime felt this on some level and tried to slap a band-aid on this issue by adding more comedy in this episode specifically, but like in the opening scene, almost all of its jokes end up falling flat because of bad comedic timing or obnoxiously lazy and rushed setups and punchlines. Even disregarding my point about the comedy, just look how little the show does to make you understand how pressed Kenshin is in this episode. Take a look at this scene from the original Rurouni Kenshin. It's his first fight with Kurogasa, and even though it happens during nighttime, the room is well lit and the music is always upbeat or of a triumphant tone. It doesn't look or sound like a big climactic fight at all, and that's because to Kenshin, it isn't. While Kurogasa is powerful, Kenshin feels calm and collected, poised enough to keep control over the situation, and perfectly capable of protecting the people around him. Switching over to the point when Kaoru is taken hostage, and boom! Way moodier and the music progressively getting more and more ominous is a cool way of hinting at Kenshin's gradual change throughout the fight. The reason it looks and sounds the way it does is that Kenshin is way more pressured during this battle, not only having to worry about himself, but also the one closest to him, as well as his inability to kill and what he'll be sacrificing by doing that. It's a simple difference in cinematic language used to convey the contrasting atmospheres, tension, and stakes of two fights that should feel like polar opposites of each other. Now take a look at the new version's way of conveying that. The lighting of the room is darker, albeit slightly, and the art style of the show itself feels grittier already, which are both minor problems on their own, but the really obnoxious part of this scene is how they constantly play up Kurogasa as a villain. There are several shots focusing on his wild and maniacal nature. The camera constantly frenzies when he goes on a slight killing spree, and Kenshin doesn't feel nearly in control enough for the contrast with their next fight to really work. They really overdid it with this guy. When it comes to the new adaptation, your only indicator that something is off about Kenshin is the way he speaks, something that, if I'm being honest, really isn't very interesting on its own. So he stopped talking like a fucking idiot. Who cares? I mean, I did in the original, because even without that as an indicator, you were perfectly capable of feeling the difference in Kenshin's mentality, like I just explained, and also because Kenshin and Kaoru have a much more endearing and earned relationship in this version of the show. Not like that really matters though, because their relationship is better in the original, even without the prior context from that show. Let's take a look at Kenshin's and Kaoru's heart-to-heart by the riverbank, for example. Even though the dialogue and a lot of the details of the scene are nearly identical in both versions of the show, the new anime manages to be much more incompetently directed. While the original adaptation makes sure to keep the characters' faces on screen at all times so you can easily tell what each of them are thinking, the new show instead decides to cut to this shot with the camera zoomed too far out, which inadvertently places more emphasis on the background during the most important part of the scene. Now, there are times when obscuring or distancing a character's face from the camera can be good. When a character is trying to mask what they're really feeling, hiding a character's face conveys that very well, but this isn't one of those scenes. It's actually the opposite, and even if it wasn't, this shot doesn't look like it's trying to hide Kaoru's face intentionally in order to make some sort of artistic statement. It just looks like it came out this way as a result of the director not knowing what to really place focus on in the scene. Even outside of this shot, just look at how little emotion Kenshin shows here in general, with the blandest of expressions that are not at all comparable to the super endearing faces of the original adaptation. I love this shot that starts off with Kenshin's face alone as he tries to reject Kaoru's offer, only for Kaoru to force her way into the frame. The faces they make are charming and play with your emotions effectively by adding some humor, but it also visually visually shows the great presence that Kaoru has in Kenshin's life now. I also love the way Kenshin figures out what this gesture actually means through these really cute as well as silently powerful facial expressions, and this is sadly not present in the new adaptation. I know it's small, but this little pause that Kenshin has here adds a level of weight and gravity to this scene. It's something that sells the importance of both the realization he's just went through and the kindness of Kaoru's actions, and because of the absence of this in the new adaptation as well as all the other stuff I mentioned, this scene ends up feeling kind of flat. In response to what's supposed to be this incredibly beautiful gesture, what does Kenshin do? He just goes, alright, and it hardly seems like he even gives a shit. It's stuff like this that makes him come off as a caricature of a person who doesn't even seem capable of having one solitary moment of vulnerability. He just feels so much more human in both the original anime and manga, and to see how fucking bland he is in the new adaptation is honestly a little depressing. The same goes for Kaoru. In the original, you feel every step and motion that she makes because the scene is put together in a way that makes her movements cohesive and highly evocative. I really like this overhead shot of the two of them as Kaoru walks to stand in front of Kenshin. Like I said earlier, this is done to add weight and gravity to the situation. By emphasizing her walking and the sound of her footsteps here, the scene builds to a more effective and dramatically satisfying moment when Kaoru hands Kenshin her ribbon. It's definitely a hell of a lot more effective than just hard cutting from one shot to the next without worrying about how that might affect the impact of the scene. Seriously, look at how the new show cuts from this shot of Kaoru standing up to this shot of Kaoru already in front of Kenshin. It's abrupt and impersonal, like the scene only wants to hit the major bullet points in order for it to make sense and just move on without properly getting you invested in the beautiful atmosphere of the conversation these two are having. And you can feel this in every single shot that follows. Aside from the incredibly cheap, bland, and forgettable feel to the new adaptation's version of the scene, the show also manages to somehow undermine the effectiveness of the gut punch that comes from how this scene ends. Right after Kaoru hands Kenshin her ribbon, almost out of nowhere Kurogasa swoops in to kidnap Kaoru, leaving the episode on a chilling cliffhanger. It hits you like a truck, effortlessly changing the tone of the scene and drastically raising the stakes of the arc. It's so effective in the original to the point where even after watching the new adaptation's episode first and knowing that Kurogasa comes in at the end to kidnap Kaoru, I still went oh shit when this moment happened. The original anime was really good at getting you to lower your guard and disarming you, and it built to this amazing moment when Kurogasa makes a move way earlier than anyone could have seen coming. And this moment isn't as impactful in the new adaptation because earlier on in that version, when Kaoru leaves the dojo to look for Kenshin, the camera lingers on this fence and we hear someone laughing creepily. Oh, and when I say this happened earlier on, that doesn't mean like way earlier on, that means right before this scene of Kaoru getting kidnapped, so there's no time for you to even potentially forget about it. Now maybe this was done to add tension to the storyline, but if so, that was completely unnecessary because the scene of Kurogasa declaring Kenshin to be his new target already did that. Hell, even the conversation between these two is also serving that purpose since Kenshin is steeling himself in preparation for his fight against Kurogasa. This silly and stupid scene of the villain laughing like EDP on his way to pick up some cupcakes is entirely redundant and should be taken out, especially if it lessens the impact of a big twist like it does here. Speaking of lessening the impact of something, it's finally time to talk about how this arc ends. After the threat is passed and Kaoru gets her ribbon back, she freaks out about the bloodstain there and starts chasing Kenshin around. What I love about the original version of this scene is that as the episode comes to an end, we see everyone breaking character laughing as they get caught up in all the fun they're having. It shows that in these moments of levity, Kenshin is able to just forget about his troubled past and simply enjoy the present with his friends. This scene just felt good to watch, and it's another example of how pivotal the comedy is to this arc. It's because of the drastic difference in tone during this episode that you feel the significance of these relationships between the characters and how they all bring out the best in each other. This also recontextualizes previous scenes of comedy because now those scenes aren't just funny things to laugh at, but an important indicator of the character's mental states. The new adaptation does not have this, and the final scene of this arc is honestly kind of infuriating. Kenshin literally just saved your ass and you're genuinely throwing a temper tantrum over a bloody ribbon? Really? This isn't an act on Kaoru's part to deliberately lighten up the mood like it was in the original. This just comes off as her actual emotional response to the situation. This is nowhere near as likable as the original because this isn't done for a purpose and this isn't enough of a tension breaker for the audience. You go from bland action to bland comedy. Yippee, what a fucking treat. On my first video, so many people left comments relating to what I said about the comedy in Rurouni Kenshin, telling me that the new version is just more mature, which is why it doesn't need to be funny, even though it still has scenes with the sole purpose of being humorous. But even if that wasn't the case, comedy does not equal immaturity. The version of the show with the more cartoony art style, exaggerated expressions, and better sense of humor manages to be more mature than the supposedly mature version of the show, while also imbuing the storyline with more meaning, specifically because of those elements leaving enough of an impression to send you on a very effective emotional roller coaster during its 7th episode. And like I've said in my video, it is the absence of this nuance in the new adaptation that makes its version of this arc toothless and lacking in any real soul. Hopefully, even if you disagree with me, you enjoyed the video and can see where I'm coming from. them, or maybe you don't and I'm just full of shit. I know I only covered 2 episodes of the old and new adaptation in this part, but I had a lot to say about them and it was starting to take way too long to write this script. Sorry for the wait, I'm a lazy person.